For those of you who are new to Walk, Listen, Create, welcome. My name's Andrew Stuck. I'm one of the co-directors of Walk, Listen, Create, and we've been running walking writers salons now for about 2 or 3 years, in which we invite an author to come and share some knowledge about their writing and also obviously the topics they're writing about. And they all tend to have some huge interest in walking. And Jack is not alone here. Jack and I will chat for about 20 minutes, then we'll open it up to questions from you all. I'd love you to start popping questions in the chat immediately you have any thoughts come to mind. We'll close the event with a multiple choice quiz. The great news is that Jack's publishers, who are Random House Penguin, have been gracious enough to give us a couple of ebooks to give away as prizes. Jack's book is a mighty tome. I think you've managed to fill 360 pages, if not more. So it's a bit of a chunk, but I can tell you I've thoroughly enjoyed reading it. I've learned lots from it. And the multiple choice quiz is an absolute killer. So, you know, watch out at the end, see whether you can win a copy of the book. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Jack. He says he's a walker, writer, and an artist. And his first book, The Lost Paths, is out now. It's the story of the hundreds of thousands of miles of paths that reach into and connect communities across England and Wales. More than just a practical way for us to walk, ride and cycle, these paths are an inheritance from our past, revealing how our ancestors interacted with and shaped their surroundings, from Iron Age footsteps to Anglo-Saxon mercenary trails, through railway age tracks and home army defences. Our paths and our land reveals a hidden history of us. But thousands of miles are still missing from our maps, and they'll be lost forever unless they are urgently reclaimed. He works to help these paths to get back on the path through his day job as head of paths at the Ramblers, Britain's walking charity. Jack, for those who are on this call who might be less familiar with the concept of rights of way, can I put you on the spot and sort of try to explain a right of way as best you can?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for everyone for coming this evening. Yeah, so I mean, a right of way is fundamentally a linear route, a path that the public has a right to use, has a right, in the technical term, it's pass and repass. So I mean, not just that, you know, they also, you know, can stop and take a photograph, have a sandwich or whatever. But yeah, so there are essentially yeah, where the public has a right to be and paths that the public have a right to use. I think it's worth saying that you know, in England and Wales, public rights of way, probably 95% plus of them over private land. So they're really about a compromise between the need for people to go around their landscapes and sort of private land ownership, really, and use of use of land for different purposes. Sorry, sorry, I got a frog in my throat there. Sorry, yeah. Hopefully you got that though. Yeah, so, and we've got 140,000 miles of public rights of way across England and Wales. They are footpaths, which obviously sort of maybe you know, it's obvious that people on foot can use those. Bridleways, which can be used by cyclists and horse riders, and restricted byways, which can be used by all of the plus people on horse and cart if they so wish. So it's also worth in a with mobility aid, mobility scooter, etc., can use all of those paths as well. So yeah, it's a fantastic network that really reaches into communities across the whole of the country.
And basically, we don't have a right to roam, do we? That there's a sort of right to roam which is sort of embedded in Scottish law. And is that the same case in Northern Ireland?
That's a great question. I mean, I have to admit, my knowledge of Northern Irish access is limited, except to say that all I hear is that it's very limited. The actual access is very limited. there are certainly many less paths and public access in Northern Ireland. I think it's an interesting question about right to roam and public rights of way. There is what you could call a right to roam over about 8% of land in England and Wales, land which will have public rights of way on it as well. In Scotland, where you have a sort of a right of responsible access, often called the right to roam, there are still public rights of way in that landscape, but they have they're sort of less formalized, maybe, or less. They have sort of they're sort of put less to the forefront of how you access sort of landscapes in Scotland. So I think they're different. They're both different approaches to how to public access of land. I think there are differences in terms of landscape and maybe what makes sense, and also some of these differences have come down through the history of how land has been used in different countries over centuries, really.
Yeah, no, okay. So I had the privilege and pleasure of interviewing you for Talking Walking about 4 years ago, and I think you just stepped into the role of losing your paths, champion or campaigner at Ramblers. So we had lots to talk about what you were planning and hoping might be achieved. But what I'm kind of interested in is, you've actually walked the whole distance from Land's End to John O'Groats. And a lot of this book is actually drawn from that. So I'm kind of interested, was the research for the book, was that something that had been, when did you get into your head you were going to write a book? That's what I'm trying to say. When did it become a book? Or when was it just a sort of hobby or a passion? And then when did it become a book? And then when did it become a job?
Yeah, I suppose, well, to go through the sequence of events, really, back in 2017, I had a very different career. I worked in the NHS, and in one of the many NHS reorganisations, I took voluntary redundancy, and I decided to sort of, with the time that enabled me sort of away from work for a period of time, I decided to walk from Land's End to John O'Groats. I went the long way round. When people often do that route, there's a sort of standardish route that people use, national trails, but I decided to basically use as much time as I could to really explore places I haven't been to before across the country, and then sort of try to link up as many of those on foot. So the sort of normal route from Land's End to John O'Groats, I think, is about 850 miles. I ended up doing about 1,550, and I think what that meant was that, because I wasn't for most of the time on the national trails, I was working out, how do I get from Leeds to Wakefield or whatever on foot? And so I was using all of the sort of ordinary, so to speak, path networks, so all the little footpaths that go across one field to another, go through woodland, the urban and suburban alleyways, the whole sort of gamut of our different types of paths. And really, I suppose in that journey, I was expecting to sort of discover amazing landscapes and parts of the country I were unknown to me, but I think I wasn't so much expecting to sort of fall in love with almost the infrastructure itself, those ordinary paths. And so, sort of coming back from that trip, I in the sort of October, November of that year, I saw a job at the Ramblers, which was to basically start this project called Don't Lose Your Way, which was about saving public rights of way which aren't recorded and protected. So I was very lucky to get that job, and then in 2021, I think it was sort of put in touch with an agent and sort of developed it into a book, really, and developed my love that had started in Land's End, John O'Groats, but meeting our fantastic volunteers and learning about the history of individual paths and the network, and the opportunity came to sort of pull that together into a book that isn't just about, it isn't a book that is about the journey from Land's End to John O'Groats, and it isn't maybe a straightforward chronological history of our public rights of way network, but I suppose it's a story about all of the different stories that can be found. I mean, it's not about them all, because there's millions, thousands, millions of those stories that can be found sort of embedded in our path network. So in a way, it's a partial, and it's one view of that. I think looking at some of the big processes that have sort of formed and created of our path network, and have also affected and made paths become lost over the years. So yeah, it was that's sort of the journey, I suppose, of where I got from where I was to the book that sits on the table next to me now.
Okay, well, I mean, I think we should give the participants here a sort of taste of what's going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post in the chat to everybody the chapter titles of Jack's book, because this is where I just think this is amazing. It's sort of, if I use the word potpourri, it sounds that you just threw it together. And I know there was a heck of a lot of work involved in this. But I mean, people can almost tackle you on any topic here, because this covers pretty much everything. Death, divorce, debt, dying, the lot. It's all in here. And what I was kind of really interested in was trying to grapple with what would you leave out in the writing, to allow people to sort of imagine what was going on. And I'll take sort of one example of which fascinated me. It comes, I think it's from the ground chapter, where you talk about China clay, and you talk about the tracks. And of course, what I hadn't really thought about, stupidly really, is that in previous centuries, majority of people in work were on foot, and they therefore would not only walk to work, but walk a lot in work. And the China clay areas in Cornwall came up to you and revealed sort of all these tracks that you discovered, and they're not necessarily rights of way. So I'm kind of interested, how did you choose what to put in, and how did you choose what to leave out?
Yeah, I mean, it was, I suppose, easy and difficult at the same time, which sounds a bit, contradictory. But I think, I mean, what I loved about writing the book is that it allowed me, and I think my editors allowed me to some extent to well, without sounding sort of too flippant, to go down many different paths and to branch off from from a sort of core subject, I suppose, of movement and of paths. I think what I discovered in writing the book, and hopefully that comes through, is that to some extent you can use the history of our past to talk about, it can take you down sort of any part of our history in a way, really. And I think some of the most enjoyable stuff for me was where I got to just read about and learn about and ultimately to look at on the ground often so many different sort of little subject areas, like the sort of I don't know, the workhouse system in Victorian and Edwardian England, or I mean, you talk about the from the ground chapter. Actually, in another chapter, in the chapter on railways, I sort of was learning about a particular type of sand that ended up being used in the Wizard of Oz to create the tornadoes and stuff like that. So you get all these just little sort of nuggets that I just loved, like sort of coming across, really. And I think that was, for me, the real pleasure in writing the book. And I suppose where I had to I didn't end up having to leave too much out, but I suppose I need to sort of still make sure that it's a book about about paths. But actually, one of the amazing things, I think, with the subject, is that you can go down all of these different avenues, and the something that's often overlooked, our path network, is actually a real can be a real sort of key way of looking at how we've lived over centuries in this country.
Well, I think the other thing is, which I thought was amazing, was that you did go down lots of rabbit holes. You managed to get yourself back out of them, which was very good. I think I'd have disappeared down there a long time ago. And yeah, I think what also came out for me, which was sort of clear, was that you started revealing the kind of barriers to what might have been existing path networks, and how we through the centuries have then done things which have blocked or stopped up those paths, and also made those paths no longer walked or walkable. So I'm kind of interested in that, because we could sort of, you talk about, just looking at those chapters again, I sort of kind of remember the railways, suddenly came along and they blocked lots of routes, and the closure of level crossings that actually make it even harder to cross the railway, and that's all on a kind of safety angle. And then you sort of talk about enclosures, and you talk about the power of the church and the dissolution of the monastery. I thought that was, I hadn't thought about that. When each time we switched from whether we were a Catholic country or a Protestant country, immediately we went Protestant, we chucked all the pilgrims. Did we burn them? I don't know, but we certainly tossed the pilgrim routes out the window. So I mean, I was kind of fascinated in all that kind of thing. So yeah, I think you did well to squirrel us along and then manage to sort of get us back out again. Which was your sort of favorite discovery?
Oh, that's a great question. What was my favorite discovery? I mean, I don't know. Oh, I'll put it on the spot there. What was my favorite discovery? I mean, I can probably just like grab a couple, I suppose, out of my head. I mean, one, when you talk about, actually particularly talking about sort of I suppose loss of paths that you were sort of referencing there, the looking at the sort of our coastline and the climate, there's a chapter called the climate coast, and I sort of had an idea about lost towns that had been sort of drowned off the coast and stuff, but actually the more I looked into that, there's this whole communities and whole towns and villages that have been lost, and that are and I suppose that's a, but actually, what about the paths that went between those communities? That what about the street names that we have names of that are now several miles off the coast? But also, that is very much a contemporary story as well. So the east coast of England is the fastest eroding coastline in Europe, and so we are losing, that we are potentially losing paths all the time. Although one of the really interesting things about the England Coast Path is that it's actually built with that in mind, and so it will roll back, unlike sort of other coastal paths of the past that have been lost. But yeah, there were so many of these sort of I suppose big processes that affect our paths, but all of some of these just little stories that can be sort of found in our paths that that just sort of jumped out. I suppose, I mean, when we talk about discoveries, I wanted to write about new towns, so I'm sort of have an interest in architecture as well, and the sort of garden city movement and new towns, and that whole sort of I suppose the optimism that comes with some of that sort of thing. So I went and explored Crawley, which I think is also, even within the new towns, even within the discussion about new towns, Crawley's often, I think unfairly overlooked or sort of maligned or whatever. And I think how the neighbourhoods were built in Crawley, I think they're actually, they work well. But I went to Crawley, and I went to a road called Small Meads, which was the first road built there in the first sort of neighbourhood that was built as sort of Newtown Crawley, and if anyone knows, Crawley has an old town that sort of sits within it and sort of is at the heart of a much bigger new town. And just from that first road to the sort of old high street, which has, you know, coaching inns on it and, you know, has a sort of real history, is a local drovers road, which is now a sort of wide alleyway, really. I mean, a sort of a green byway, I suppose it sort of feels like, that is sort of enclosed in this sort of much newer landscape, and it's got, you know, trees that are much older than the new town itself. And so that was, you know, I don't think that was one of these ones where I went there and walked on the ground, and only after that really was sort of like, hang on, what is that sort of path, what is that, you know, and then sort of trace the history from there, really. So it's sort of, that was what I loved writing about the book, really, was I get to go down those little avenues, but, you know, just sort of reading and learning about the landscape that I was sort of walking in is it was always fascinating.
Well, the good news is that someone has chipped in a couple of questions in the chat, and they were questions I was going to ask you. So much better is that I get KT. I don't know who you are. I don't know, man or woman, but KT, would you like to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah. So I mean, this is curiosity mainly. As a sort of writer myself as well, I'm interested in your sort of process. Do you write as you walk? Do you make notes? Do you do it all from memory? And then also, as if that wasn't enough questions in one go, where does research play into the process, sort of before and after, or before, during, after? You know, I'm just sort of keen to know what that process looks like when it involves so much walking.
Yeah, so I think so it sort of varied, really. I mean, I think I sort of thought, oh, I'll set out with great intentions and I'll have a notebook that will look amazing, you know, sort of you know, with really beautiful sort of documentation. I do have that, and, you know, I'm not saying it's as beautiful as but yeah, so I took sort of notes as I walked, you know, in that notebook, but also sometimes just sort of on my phone and stuff. I mean, the other thing I do a lot when I'm, you know, especially, I mean, when I'm going out for a walk anyway, but also particularly when I'm, you know, doing walks that I, you know, thought would end up in the book, is just lots and lots of photographs, you know, so photographs of the landscape, but also close-up photographs of the vegetation and the, you know, colors. And so to really sort of you know, to as a sort of almost a photo notebook, really. I also you know, like some of my other background is a sort of visual artist as well, so the notebooks aren't just drawn, but there's bits of vegetation, bits of sort of stuff like leaflets, sort of bits and bobs like that I picked off the ground and that are sort of stuck in there as well. So you know, my notes probably do need a little bit of tidying up and filling in some of the gaps from notes on my phone. But yeah, so I sort of that was sort of how I collected in the field. And then in terms of research, I mean, it sort of varied. I mean, there were certainly some paths that, you know, I wanted to write about a particular subject, and so did the research in advance to find a path that would allow me to talk about that subject, and then went to walk it. And then there were some, like, say, maybe like the Crawley example is one where I sort of knew where the first neighborhood was, and I just sort of wanted to walk around, and almost, so the research there sort of was almost after the fact sort of thing, really. So it does vary. I mean, the other thing I would give it a massive shout out, and obviously it always needs some verification and some you know, sort of fact checking or whatever, but I one thing that I made sure to include in my acknowledgements is that, you know, I love there's so many local communities that have, you know, created information boards and notice boards and parish websites and all of that sort of stuff, and that's, you know, something that I've, you know, maybe we do as a country quite well, and maybe it happens across the world as well. But, you know, so actually there was some of those avenues I'm talking about just came from a passing mention on some sort of information board that someone had put up, you know, in the center of a village or next to a path or whatever, that then took me down more of those avenues afterwards.
Yeah, do you want to come back on that at all, Catherine, or not?
No, I mean, I particularly like that bit about information boards, because it is, I like, yeah, when it comes to like place writing, you suddenly, as a writer, become really grateful for information boards, because there's stuff that I've not been able to find anywhere on the internet that I can, but that if I take a picture of the notice board and I've got that information then.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's nice
and like
to know.
all sort of plaques, old and new as well, right? Anything with words written on it, I'm always like, what's that? What is it?
Yeah.
Commemorating, so it could be like a new information board, or it could be something that was, someone decided to put up in the 50s or whatever, or earlier, to say this. And that's fantastic.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks.
Okay, Dave's got, and I've noticed that Arthur has got his hand up, so we'll just go to Dave. Do you want to pitch in, Dave?
I can do. Now I'll leave my video off because I'm multitasking while eating dinner, and no one likes to watch people eating dinner on video. So. But my question is, you mentioned, Jack, that you had a previous career in the NHS, and I know kind of Ramblers seem to be doing quite a lot on the mental health benefits, I suppose the health, but specifically the mental health benefits of walking. And I wondered just if you've got anything to say about that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, there is almost like there is such a wealth of, academic research now about the benefits of walking. In a way, I'm not going to sort of go back over that because it just is so, I think, sort of, there is a lot of research there, but also I think sort of intrinsically people, understand, the benefits of that. I mean, and particularly, maybe, with things like COVID and stuff like that, particularly sort of the mental health and well-being benefits of even being able to go out for our hour's walk or whatever. I mean, the Ramblers, talking about the Public Rights of Way network, we commissioned some research last year from the New Economics Foundation. Really extensive piece of research that no one's sort of ever done in that detail before, to look at the health and well-being value of the Public Rights of Way network. Because I think we sort of commissioned that because to some extent we think that paths are often overlooked when we're talking about green space. We sort of talk about destinations and parks and things like that, which are fantastic, but actually paths, the linear routes that we walk, are sort of a massive contributor. But that research found that there is 1.8 billion pounds worth of health and well-being value that the Public Rights of Way network gives us every year in England and Wales. And so, that's a really useful stat when we're making the case for investment and support for paths. And that's I think a fair description about just looking on that particular metric. There's obviously loads of other benefits the path bring, and in a way what I talk about in the book is that actually we shouldn't just be thinking about paths as a practical and practical thing. We should be thinking about it as part of our heritage. So there are lots of other value that we can place on it, but definitely in terms of that sort of health and well-being value, paths are really fundamental, I think.
I was going to chip in here and actually say you actually write about the mentally ill as well in the book, which I think is sort of great, because you talk about the infirmaries and the workhouses and how there was a change at some period. I can't remember what the dates were, but there was a change where people who could present themselves as a workhouse or an infirmary, an asylum, and say, I need a bed for the night, and they would have casual wards of people who would be turning up, but people could only stay a couple of nights and they'd be kicked out back on the road. So yeah, there was that sort of change also about how we treated the vagrants.
I mean, and I think, I mean, obviously that's not everyone in that group would have had mental health issues. They're essentially the penniless, the people needing support and shelter. But yeah, like the system of that was sort of instituted that meant that you could get you didn't have to just get sort of relief, I suppose, although it was sort of mean relief sometimes locally, but you could get it sort of outside of your community. But it was in these casual wards, they were called, and they were nicknamed the spikes. But because of the system, they were only people were only allowed to stay there for 2 nights. And so what it ended up doing was creating these circuits, these sort of informal routes that are on top of our sort of map almost, where what were called the tramps would literally tramp, would walk from one community to another but on these sort of circuits that in a way aren't. I mean, I think there's a real sort of there's a real lost history there, because most of these routes weren't written down, right? They were passed orally from person to person, and but they were these sort of tramping circuits that went from one community to another. And in the book, I walk from what's it called? Sorry, I can read on in Northamptonshire to Wellingborough. I've forgotten what it's called. Kettering. Sorry, from Kettering to Wellingborough, to sort of trace to some extent the course that those tramps might have walked, but very much knowing that I can walk those routes or where they might have walked, but I can't walk in their shoes, because I'm a comfortable person with shelter, and I can get the train home after my so yeah, I think that was one of the stories I think in a way I'm sort of proudest to write about, because I think it is an overlooked part of our history and the history of movement across this country.
Okay, so we did have someone else in the chat. We had Fred. Fred, can you pitch in?
Hello, you hear me?
Yes.
Hi.
Yes.
Yes, I have a question about, you say that sometimes the past have been barricaded, blocked. So how do you respond to this situation? And what is the law in England related to the mobility when you cross private land? And if this law has changed during the years?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said at the beginning, I mean, in a way, the public rights of way are in theory about how people should be able to cross private land, to interact with their landscapes. In terms, I mean, it's worth saying that trespass in England and Wales is not a criminal offence. It is only a civil offence, unless you're sort of trespassing and committing damage at the same time, sort of thing. So there have been various times over the years where governments have tried to make it a criminal offence, and the Ramblers have been very much at the forefront, and other organisations at the forefront of making sure that doesn't happen. I mean, one interesting sort of thing that I write about in the book, I think, is that well, I think it's interesting, I definitely write about it, is the concept of public rights of way have existed for hundreds and hundreds of years in English law, but it was only from the late 1940s that these paths had to be sort of proactively recorded, and actually that has been a step change in how we can access our countryside. So before, if you used back in say in the 19th century, if the public used a path and then a landowner decided to block it off, you'd have to go to a local court, and you'd have to sort of prove that it was a place that the public should be using almost after the fact, after it had been blocked. Whereas actually that 140,000 miles of public rights of way are proactively recorded and protected, so people know where they are, and they know that they should be free for people to use. And I think there's a really interesting thing about the when the legislation was passed for that for those paths to be sort of proactively recorded. It came in the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act in 1949, and so if you think about the English context at the time, this is just after the Second World War. It's when a radical government is creating the National Health Service, is nationalising industries, is taking steps for decolonisation. I think it's really interesting that at the same time that government decided that one of the priorities, and I think rightly, was about creating our national parks, but also sort of securing public access for the public, for the people, to our sort of amazing green spaces. So yeah, I think you know, it's not to say that that was perfect, that piece of legislation, but I think that's a really sort of interesting context that at that time the government decided to sort of throw a protective cloak over our paths and to make sure that people knew their rights when they were out in the countryside.
Yeah, another question. It was related to your cover and the fox on the cover. I didn't read your book yet, so I suppose you have a story of an encounter with this fox?
That is a great question, and I have to admit, if you read the book and you're looking for a fox, you will be disappointed. The reason that the fox appears on the cover is the illustration was commissioned by my publishers, and I think when they were looking for inspiration for sort of a cover that I might like and that, you know, chimes with my personality and with the book, I think they looked on my Twitter account, and I'm a bit obsessed with the urban foxes that roam southeast London. And so it isn't a fox in the book, but there is several foxes on the cover of the book because yeah, I mean, there is something about, you know, I remember going to an event years ago for actually, I think it was the launch of Slowways, which someone's mentioned in the chat. But there was people were asked to describe what animal most sort of sum them up, and I think I did say an urban fox that sort of roams the streets of in a non-sinister way, roams the streets of London. You know, so yeah, it's more of a sort of personal nod rather than thematic in the book.
Okay, the good news is that Arthur's managed to get a really good question in the chat. So even though we can't hear him, the question was, what impact do you want your book to have?
Yeah, I mean,
travelogue, history, public rights of way campaigning. What kind of impact would you like it to have?
That's a great question. I think it's twofold, really. I mean, you know, ultimately, you know, I've written the book as something hopefully that people will enjoy reading. You know, that's why I go reading things, you know, to discover new things and to enjoy writing. And so, you know, there is certainly it isn't a straightforward, you know, history of our public rights of way. You know, at least a third to a half of it is travel writing, nature writing, whatever you call it. You know, it's sort of descriptive and not just sort of a sort of piece of research. And I would want from that for people to, you know, fall in love with the Path Network in the way that I have and the history that's contained in it, and then that goes through to the campaigning, because, you know, the network exists as it does because of the actions of thousands of people over, you know, certainly, especially over the last sort of 150 years, but I'm sure going back further than that as well, to protect and assert the rights of the public to use our paths. And that work is, you know, continuing now with, you know, with our volunteers at the Ramblers and other organisations like the British Horse Society and the Open Spaces Society and the Peak and Northern Footpath Society and many others who are protecting our paths. So I'd love people to not just you know, to hopefully feel the same thrill about the ordinary history that I get from the Path Network, but also to be advocating for our paths and to go and walk them and to go and, you know, be campaigning for them and to be volunteering to save them. I mean, one thing we haven't really spoken about a lot in so far this evening is that, you know, I talk about 140,000 miles of recorded public rights of way. You know, we also have over 49,000 miles of potential paths that are public rights of way but that aren't recorded, and we've got a deadline of the 1st of January 2031 to get those applied for so they can be recorded and protected. I mean, ultimately, I would love the book to be the argument for why we should get rid of that deadline entirely, because, you know, we wouldn't put a ticking clock on protecting our archaeological history or our built history and listed buildings. I think that we would say after this date we can't list any more buildings. You know, we wouldn't do that. So why do it with our paths? So ultimately, I'd like people to, you know, to be advocating to get rid of that deadline, but in place of that, to also volunteer to get those paths on the map so they can be protected and be, there and open for everyone to be able to use.
Who of all the characters you came across was a character you would have liked to have gone for a walk with?
Oh, that's a great question. There was a guy who was has the sort of, again, slightly sort of grand title of one of the fathers of the modern road, Blind Jack Metcalf, I think his name is, and he was just an amazing list of things. He was, like a card player and I think an oboist, but also he was an engineer of roads, and also someone who would undertake these massive walking challenges, walking across the country, whilst being, visually, impaired, sort of thing. And so I think he would have been a real character to go walking with across the country.
There be any rules for creating paths which can all do exploring common land, or should we be free to leave our imprints on the landscape as we please?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a really interesting question. So in terms of, I mean, there is law about creating paths through usage. I mean, ultimately, the 140,000 miles of paths have been created through usage over, over decades, centuries, and millennia. There is still highways law that essentially says if the public use a path for 20 years, it becomes a public right of way. There's some caveats, and partly the work of the Ramblers is making sure those paths actually get recorded and challenging legal challenges and objections to those. I personally think that I think it's fantastic that the history of how people have interacted with their landscape can be tracked through our public rights of way, but I do think we probably need better ways or additional ways of creating paths, of linking up more communities and sort of filling in gaps in the map, sort of thing. So yeah, hopefully we can do more in that regards.
All right, Jack. Thank you very much for entertaining us this evening. I'm hoping everyone will go out and buy Jack's book. It's called The Lost Paths, A History from Here to There, I believe, or a history of walking from here to there.
Something like that.
And it's available in all good bookshops, he says. And it's a huge tome, and it's a bargain at £20. Is that not right?
It is. I mean, quite a lot of them are, it's always produced in various places. But yeah, it's I'd encourage hopefully people to go to their local bookshop. It's been very popular, I think, in local bookshops, particularly, so independent bookshops, which is fantastic, because I've explored and found so many new bookshops through promoting it. So I'd encourage people to go to their local bookshop. But even if you buy it locally, a review on Amazon is always useful for sort of moving it up people's sort of algorithm and stuff. So yeah, hopefully people go out and hopefully enjoy it. It's also, you can also, if you want, you can listen to me for 11.5 hours reading the book as well, if you fancy getting on audiobook and going out for a walk maybe whilst listening to it. I don't know, but yeah.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. Terrific. Okay, well, Jack, well done. Congratulations. So in the meantime, everyone, have a very good evening, and some of you are having a very good morning in Australia, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks for coming. Thanks very much, Jack.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a good evening.